What seemed to me to resonate around you with folks that I did not expect was that you really never seemed to dislike anybody on the campaign trail. You didn't dislike people who didn't agree with you. You didn't dislike people who insulted you. You didn't dislike the people you were running against. You spoke fondly and with a lot of empathy of towards people on the other side. The way you framed your policies had that dimension. You're talking about the Bernie Sanders and imagining yourself to the left of him. But one way people experience politics isn't just ideological, it's also on this axis of confrontationalness. And you had a pretty distinctive like left policy agenda, but on the confrontational axis, you were way down, right? You would talk to people Democrats would rarely talk to, go on programs they would rarely go on. And even now on Twitter, I think you very self-consciously cultivate a very nice persona in a very unnice space. And I'd like to hear a bit about how you think about that, because whether it was all authentic, I think there's at least some recognition that it has power now. And given that it's a pretty basic thing, I think it probably had more power than you would have expected, or certainly than I would have expected.
Wow, Ezra, I hadn't thought of it in those terms. But I mean, you've known me for a while, so you know that the nice thing is a complete facade that I'm actually naturally very bitter. No, it's the case that I like most Americans, and then I think that there have been massive problems that have been built up over decades and decades. And you wrote a book on polarization and why we're polarized. And I feel like people have gotten driven into different corners and pitted against each other in a way that's unproductive. I naturally don't get angry at people that disagree with me. I kind of expect a degree of political asynchrony because, it's like not like someone's going to believe everything you believe. And one of the things that I did find running for president was that the media would often try and goad me into conflict. It would be like, this person said this. What do you think about that? And the dynamic was supposed to foment an expression of outrage. And then I would say something that seemed to me to be like the natural reaction. But I just think that the outrage cycle is very, very negative. And I think a lot of Americans, including me, are very tired of it. But I can genuinely say it wasn't really a strategy on my part. And it's not a strategy now, except insofar as when I'm putting out a message, I just find it more productive for me to be positive than for me to throw a rock at somebody.
It always struck me, too, that it reflected in part the media you came up through. So I think when most Democrats run for president, they think about getting coverage on, MSNBC and in Democratic or liberal aligned publications, which tend to reward a more confrontational approach. And that's true also for centrist publications, right? You have a great story on your blog about being at an early Iowa event, and like all the reporters are there to hear Michael Avenatti, including like the centrist reporters who just want conflict. But you came up, I mean, you were on this podcast pretty early in your campaign, but you did Joe Rogan's podcast, my friend Sam Harris. You were on like a lot of YouTube world things, and it's a very political space, and sometimes it can be even an angry space, but it's like a more mixed space. You had like a lot of fans on Reddit and 4chan. And that struck me as like informing your approach way through that those are different worlds to talk to, where people have different political concerns. And it always struck me that you ended up representing a slightly less polarized media in what ended up working for you and what you then were rewarded for saying and representing in politics.
Ezra, I genuinely went where they would have me, I guess, where initially the MSNBCs and CNNs and centrist publications were not very excited to have me on, frankly. So if you were me and you were like, who wants to talk to me? Like, hey, do you want to talk to me? It's one reason I'm grateful to you, because you had me on when others were not. And so I'm grateful to you. And I've always seen you as a very, very smart, fact-driven purveyor of what you regard as truth, and it's one reason I appreciate you in this conversation so much. And I did not get that vibe from some other outlets and journalists. And so, it really was a necessity being the mother of invention, where I would talk to people that would have me on. And a lot of those folks were YouTubers and podcasters and folks who didn't have a cable network behind them.
Yeah, it worked. I mean, I want to get to UBI, so we won't spend all time looking at retrospective of your campaign, but it did just strike me as I thought you and Pete Buttigieg did the best job of this, and you did somewhat differently, right? I don't think Pete Buttigieg would have gone on Ben Shapiro's show and debated circumcision. Like, that wasn't his vibe. But there was Joe Biden, for his virtues, has a very old media view of politics and also doesn't do that much media. And a lot of Democrats who'd come up through the ranks for a long time, like, they saw media very much, I would call it the way it was in 2005. And now there's this burbling, fractured, and it can be very polarized, but it also can be very mixed up in a way that can be useful world out there. And that a lot of it has much more audience than people, I think, in the mainstream media recognize. What some of these folks on YouTube are able to command is in the millions. It rivals the cable networks, but it doesn't have like the mainstream establishment respect that, say, a cable network does, and so it gets ignored. But it's no worse a way to reach people. And I think Reddit had that quality for you too. Like, you were very big on Reddit. I was just on Reddit yesterday, and you're involved, I guess, in some California data privacy initiative, and it had 23,000 upvotes just noting that you were part of it. So these are pretty different worlds, and I wonder how much you think the Democratic Party, or just traditional politicians in general, are missing them and leaving these worlds unspoken to.
Well, this to me is something we should talk about more, Ezra, because I think the shifting media landscape is going to impact politics very dramatically, and some folks are going to be late to it. Like, you're on top of it just from that line of questioning. But if you look at the cable news audiences, you're looking at the low millions, and it tends to be like the same 2 million people over and over again. And you're talking about a massive population of, tens of millions of voters. And so you hit it on the head, where if you look at the audience of some of the biggest podcasts, it goes into the millions. It is higher than the cable newscasts. And the cable newscasts drive this media narrative bubble that then gets self-reinforcing, and then everyone looks out and says, like, hey, aren't you concerned about whatever the heck we were concerned about yesterday? And meanwhile, like, they're just listening to Joe Rogan or whomever, like that they're getting a very different perspective, and they're hearing about issues that are more relevant to them than a lot of the DC-oriented issues. The biggest example of that on the trail was impeachment. I don't think I got a single question about impeachment the entire time. And this was when he was actually getting impeached. So there are different conversations happening, and it would be very beneficial for politicians generally, but Democrats in particular, to start trying to broaden their universe, because what you don't want to do is just end up in a world where you're just talking to each other and then wondering why no one's listening to you. And that's the danger.
And one of the things that I like about these different worlds, as somebody who I try to spend a certain amount of my media diet in subcultures that are not my main one, because I think it's important to know how their argumentative universes work and what they consider important and unimportant. And this, to me, was always a secret of your campaign that people didn't quite realize, that politics, Washington politics, has developed a set of things that it considers like the questions of the day, the week, the month, the year. So, at a certain point, it's impeachment, which is very, very, it was important. Like, I ran an impeachment podcast, and I think it's important what was happening there. But taxes, healthcare, I mean, these are real things. You might ask, like, how did this guy, Andrew Yang, get on Joe Rogan and some of these other shows? Because he doesn't allow just anybody on. That's a big show. He has a lot of options about who comes on. And there's this whole world that is very focused on AI risk and what that's going to do and how that's going to change things. And when you came up and wanted to move that up as an issue in politics, increase, like as a political scientist would say, increase its salience in politics, there was a world of people there for that, because they were already having that conversation, but nobody in politics was. Like, politics reflected the set of issues that Washington thought was important and understood how to talk about. But it's not the only set of issues people care about. And so then there are these whole worlds that are really underserved in terms of their concerns. And like what always struck me as an interesting bypass you took into this was like the value of your campaign to me was it elevated concerns that deserve more attention in politics than they typically get, not just solutions, but concerns. And you know that I have a different view on a lot of the AI economic risk than you do, or at least somewhat. But there's no doubt that it should be talked about. And so you went where people were talking about it. And I think there was a lot of surprise that so many people were so concerned and so engaged on this and so ready for a candidate to try to say, no, this should be one of the 10 issues we talk about. Like, let's move something else out of the frame.
Yeah, that's right, Ezra. Where if you talk to techies, they're much more concerned about AI. And as you know, the central argument of my campaign around automation than a lot of other Americans. And they were happy to talk to a political figure who was talking about something that they'd been thinking about for months or years. And one of the funny byproducts of it all was that I ended up having conversations with people that didn't feel terribly political, if you know what I mean. It was like, look, like what's going on with AI? Like, what should we be concerned about? Like, what does that competitive landscape with China look like over time? And because of that, I ended up reaching audiences that generally did not consider themselves super political. And hopefully I did broaden the range of concerns that we should be looking at as a country. It wasn't very deliberate on my part. I mean, I just cared about what I cared about and went to folks who also cared about it. But it is a sign how both DC and the media have this relationship where there's like a set of prescribed concerns that may or may not line up with the concerns around the country. Thank you for listening in. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you did, please do subscribe to Yang Speaks and click on notifications so we can let you know every time we have a new episode.